I look at trees and plants. When I was a little girl, I used to see movement in grasses and plants. And all of those things, poetry, dance, theater, visual arts, to me are the same. And I know that people think because I was a dancer, that creates my idea of music in the work. But I still sometimes, and maybe I'm just confused, because I don't see that theater necessarily, I'm not making new theater, I'm not making new dance, but it's innate probably in my personality. I think even as a child, I started, my parents started with piano. Of course, everybody did when I was younger, but I didn't like sitting there all the time. I like getting up and moving around. And for me, even moving around on the surface or whatever surface I make, is a part of the poetry, and maybe more poetry for me in paint than anything else. Dance is poetry, music is poetry. So I think I see poetry in just about everything, and in the paint. And I think culturally, my work just emanates from me because I was self-trained. I didn't have art classes until I started college. So I was doing everything, having been exposed to indigenous people in Alaska, having been exposed even before Alaska to nature. So I keep going back to nature because I think nature is the beginning and the end of everything. And I'm looking at palms right behind, in the garden that actually are interwoven. There's weaving going on, there's movement, and the aspects of the way plants grow with the background of nature and clouds. It's just incredible to me, the way that plants take up space, the way that trees take up space, and communicate with one another is very important to me. So I don't know whether that says it completely, but it's what's in my mind all the time as far as how I think. And I relate that to what I think human beings should be, and we are not. We've become really messy, and we take up too much space, and we ruin space all around us, everything that's natural. But I know that plants, no matter how much we try to destroy plants and trees and earth, they come back. There's a painting, a little painting, 1971. When I saw the photograph of it having been found, I thought it was much bigger than it is. And I always say it's really hard to make a good small painting. But in that painting, I used graphite. I noticed, because I was looking at it very closely, that I actually drew the image with graphite and then worked over it with paint. And I was just beginning to develop how I put down layers of paint, acrylic paint, as if it was watercolor. And so the newest paintings that are 2026, I'm still layering and also using another kind of paint. I've always used the Nova Color paints from Los Angeles, from the Mexican family, since the early 1960s. I've been using various kinds of acrylic since the early 1960s. And each year or decade, the paints have been developed with glazes. So while here, I was using the Brazilian paints that have been developed by artists, and they're dense. The color is just as intense. The mediums have the quality of the paints that I've been using, which are layered, but I'm still layering. I'm still learning how to layer the paint, so that over the decades, I've been finding different ways of layering the mediums and the pigments, and learning the strength of the mediums and how they can be built up as architectural structure. I'm really interested in architectural structure. And I love looking at all of the structures of buildings that have too much concrete as related to the nature that also is integrated in them here. But they're actually structurally just so gorgeous and have lasted all these decades. So it's from decade to decade, learning how architectural structure and strength can be a guideline for painting to continue as a form, but also painting as sculpture. So I'm combining the two things that I love, that I can do, that I know that I've done all my life. That's sculpture and painting. And then taking the paintings off the wall, as the little one in 1971 was on the wall, and then there's some others in the 90s when I was in transition, trying to understand what I was going to do next. These final paintings that are totally structural acrylic paint become form, become sculpture, and I hope relate to architectural form in a way that I love. Even though I'm not an architect, I would love to be one, but this is the way I do it. Well, the first things that I saw in the first week when we were setting up the studio space were in the museum. Actually, the first thing we saw was the Agnes Varda film, which made me feel really good because I didn't think I'd get to see the film. And she actually photographed my largest painting that I've ever done on a huge building. But it made me feel very proud because I think she was important filming the Chicano arts music movement and the Black Panthers, honestly. So I saw that as film and photography that actually documented people and life, because she had a really good way of seeing real people. And then the next thing we saw was in the museum with the wonderful glass walls, seeing the fronts and backs of artists' work. And my work is double-sided. But then when the studio was set up, I was in the studio. So I didn't really, I think maybe we went to see one or two younger artist exhibitions. I think I was more impressed by the artists that I was seeing and meeting here who looked like artists. They're not pretending to be collectors or something else or trying to be overly elegant. And the work was raw still. The younger artists that I saw, their work is still in that beginning where you touch, like my little 1971 painting. I look at that and I see, oh, that was me really young, where I was very delicate about how I was putting the paint down and very careful how I was making composition. And I could still see that in some of the artists having exhibitions. And then it was after, I was in the studio for 2 or 3 weeks, I think. Didn't go out, because I tend to do that. I stay in the studio and paint and sleep. And that's it. And then when all the work was finally taken out for the exhibition, it was fascinating to me that the older artists, more mature artists' work that I saw is most impressive to me. And it has something to say about experience and practice over the years. For me, I did not expect to have all these wonderful things happening to me, exhibitions and being included with artists that I admire until I became this age, that I am now. And so it was really wonderful for me to meet some of the older artists. I was just impressed to see the strength of the work. And even with the younger artists and the older artists, you kind of look at younger artists' work and you know sometimes where they're going, what's going to happen if they continue, they keep going. And then the artist who's showing right now with me, she's very young, but her work is really mature for the experience that she's had. And I feel that because I think I was very young and self-taught, pretty much just with a liberal arts education. Um, and it's the strength and determination you can see in a younger artist's work, and you know they're going to, but I still like the idea that we have to kind of move along and suffer a little bit and go through many changes to get to this mature stage. If that makes any sense. I think that, yeah, that's, I don't think I'm prejudiced. I just think I could see maturity, the artists who had the leather and wax and metal, using materials in a really, that are challenging materials. And as a younger artist, I think my work in this exhibition shows those transitions where I'm still trying to learn how to use the materials, use the work. You mentioned material, gravity, and what was the other one? Those three things, trying to incorporate in learning. Every day I'm learning how to paint and how to make sculpture and how to see. I was just happy to be able to work again because we spent 5 years working on the large retrospective, which covered 6 decades of my work. And the focus on detail for the catalog and for the exhibition, the curators being very careful, working with all the writers, takes up quite a bit of attention. And at some point, having this final big retrospective, it almost feels as if, is this the end of everything? Am I never going to be able to paint again? Or never make any art? Or do I have any more ideas? Has my brain just stalled? Maybe I need to read more. Maybe I need to, not look at the television, not look at now we have the cell phones. And I sort of craved when I was younger, and there were no cell phones, we still had to, if you wanted to make a phone call, you wrote notes. When I was younger, we all wrote notes and letters. We kept journals. Writing was important in that communication. So I kept journals here. Tried to keep a journal almost every day, for even if it was just to say, oh, well, I ate vegetables today, or, I had something, we had sushi. But that time in the studio to have, and it was almost putting down the first brushstroke, the first mark is very scary when you haven't made anything or done anything that you feel is relevant, especially when you look at your whole life's work in a retrospective, and it covers from baby steps all the way through to my final piece that I really enjoyed in the retrospective is a huge room with 7 pieces on the wall and a big installation piece in the middle that's relevant to the environment and what I'm interested in as far as what's happening in the world. And to me, that was the culmination of all these decades. So then I thought, what do I do? How do I go to the next step? And then all of a sudden there's space because you have to go to openings and interviews and all these things that get in the way. You've got to deal with your taxes and all sorts of stuff and traveling. So my arrival here and having a space that was empty and also using new paints, the Brazilian paints, it was as if, for example, I haven't used oil paint except oil bars in the 70s or 80s with graphite. This was the first time I had actually used oil bars, but I was using them on the fragments of marble that were taken from, Rika's next door apartment floor that were throwaways, those throwaway things. And then each time being handed another scrap or something, or finding something. I came with no supplies, really. I came with one little jar of iridescent paint. And it turned out the medium that I like to use, the heavy gel medium, I thought I had a whole quart, and it turned out it sunk down and there was only half. So I had to really learn how to play with the mediums, with the new paint, the Brazilian paint, and learn what those mediums could do Uh, and then only using a very small amount of the Brazilian pigment, which is dense and thick. And it took a while, but it was a struggle. I love challenges. So I have to make challenges for myself. But this whole experience was also in natural light from sun up. So that it was really wonderful to be able to get it when the sun came in the window early in the morning and then work till sundown because it's dark. And there were only the lights from the top of the building shining into the studio. So the next thing was just to read, which I was able to do. It was really important to be able to read a whole book of poetry, read chapters that had incredible expansive vocabulary, I have to say, in English, by an author. I was reading Fred Moten's book that has just, he uses incredible language that's almost like working a cryptogram, and he's mixing Latin. In my mind, the words I was seeing were long versions of Latin, long versions of other languages, but in English, and words that people don't use anymore. So that was kind of a challenge also in relationship to the challenge of the paint, a different paint and a different vocabulary. If that's kind of, I'm just realizing that was kind of the two things, one next to the other. And not writing any real poetry of my own, but reading another poet who uses space the way I have used some space, and kind of really weird, that seems like puzzles and things that people don't understand, some outer space relationship. Oh, very much like the music that I love, which is out music. People like, now, of course, when I have to think of all the names, the flute player, Charles Lloyd, in my exhibition, that was the music that accompanied my work. I like out music, and I think because as a dancer also, that's the music that is more sound. I think the person who popped up on your phone, the phone the other day was Arto Lindsay, who's about sound. And I was confusing him with a aesthetician, theoretical art historian whose name is Arturo Lindsay. So the two of them are all sort of out in literature and in music. And I guess that's part of my mind as well, in the music. And I'll think of all those folks that I love that were playing in San Francisco clubs when I was young, when I was there. You could walk down the street in Divisadero or the Fillmore, and you'd hear these sounds coming out of the clubs, just the music. And it turned out to be the most famous musicians you could ever imagine playing in these little clubs, and we were too young to go into. So that's affected my work, and it still affects it in the sense. Eric Dolphy, Charles Lloyd, I mentioned. Oh, Thelonious Monk, of course. When I was playing piano, I was supposed to play a nice little tune, Up in the Sky, Ever So High, and I went off in my recital, and I thought I was Thelonious Monk. I was going into, so I think I riff in the paintings, and that's a part of, I did not have sound here. So that's part of that essence of what happened to me here, because all I had were the birds outside, the dump trucks, people talking in the cadence of language that I didn't totally understand everything, but you could hear conversations down in the courtyard. Sometimes there were chants, the people having, what do you call them, not picketing, what do you call it when people gather, everybody gathering, protesting, now they protest. So all of those sounds were part of what I was making here. It started because I taught first and second grade in Los Angeles. And I learned partly how to paint from first and second graders because there was no supplies. I'd come from on tour from South America and landed in Los Angeles. To me, and during that time, I graduated from college, came to South America. That was my first really political, intellectual understanding outside of San Francisco, going to college there, which is a really different kind of environment from many other places. People are very intellectually in tune with community in the Bay Area, San Francisco. So you grow up with making art that also is about community and about issues. And then while I was in South America, there were several things happening from each city. We went to uprisings and things happening. When I moved to Los Angeles, right after, I moved to a neighborhood that basically was Latino, Latin American, mixed, and also mixed couples, mixed people together in the Echo Park neighborhood. So my first studio was just a little studio that was passed on. Then I moved to another house. The house was sold. I didn't want to buy it because I didn't want to be a teacher for the rest of my life, I thought. But I did learn from the first and second graders. I had the same students for 2 years because they were too young. They were too old for kindergarten. They were too young to be in first grade. So I had to help teach them to read and use artwork because we had no supplies. While I was doing that, I was really affected by how children put down paint, how they work. So the next step was to get a studio space. I took a class with Charles White, and I asked people around about studio, and they didn't know what I was talking about because most of them were becoming some trade that they could become as an artist and make a living. So I was able to find this beautiful studio space that reminded me of the hotel I stayed in Montevideo. These beautiful Spanish buildings with balconies and gardens. And that was my studio. And I always emphasized that it was my studio. That's what it was supposed to be. But the artists in Los Angeles weren't used to seeing a big space as studio. They thought only of galleries having big spaces. So it was 1,000 square feet. It wasn't as big as some of these spaces here, but it was larger than they experienced. So they could not understand my wanting to just be in there to be a painter. And so when I took class with Charles White, I met the artists in that class were David Hammonds and Charles White. And most of the people didn't speak to me. I was this little girl, in the class. But I could draw. And it was the first time that I'd ever had a teacher, even though I'd just come out of 4 years of painting classes. We worked together as peers in the painting classes at San Francisco State. Our professors came through 2 or 3 times a year. Charles White would talk to us, and he'd talk about his experiences, his history of having to share paint and drawing supplies and books with 2 other artists when he was in school and didn't have enough money. So those things sort of, were new to me, new ideas. I did not know that artists were separated by culture, by color, or by gender. I just thought you were supposed to be an artist and you get a studio, that's what you're supposed to do. And so then I met David Hammonds and Dan Conchalar and Timothy Washington, and they asked to have a show, have an exhibit. Actually, Timothy and one of my classmates, David Swanson from San Francisco, and his friend who was a jewelry maker. That was the first exhibit. And then after that, I didn't know what to do. So I first met the photographer that I knew actually had been taking photos of Mel Edwards' work. And before I had that studio, Gallery 32, and it may have been even before I think I was passing through to go to South America. I may have seen Mel Edwards' studio space, which was cavernous. It was this big barn. He wasn't there, but his family was in the back. We dropped up the photo, and it was really impressive to see this large space. And I knew that's the kind of space you were supposed to have. So then when I took the class with Charles White and met all these other people, that's when they came around to look to see what I did find. I think I must have said, well, I found a studio space in this building. And most of them have the idea that you couldn't move into a space like that. I didn't know any better. I didn't know that you were restricted from living in places. I just said if, I could, and I exchanged the words, gallery and studio. So I thought the manager wouldn't understand what I meant if I exchanged the two words, but I was telling the truth, but I wasn't telling the truth. I was saying it's a gallery, it's a studio. And after that first show that we had, I had no idea what we were going to do. And I'd met Mel Edwards' younger brother, their whole family actually, and he just came along. He was a teenager then, and he came along with the camera and took a photo of us sitting in the lobby. And those were people from my watercolor class. And so we decided to do a watercolor exhibition, and that's one of the only exhibitions I was in other than the Sapphire show with the women artists, and that was 2 years later. So after a series, actually each artist would tell another artist, and then they'd come in with people they knew, and we had an audience, and David Hammonds would actually make a new print. Something would happen to him, and he'd come in and just hang a piece on the wall in the middle of a so-called reception. It was very loose, but it was organized because I had that kind of experience where you just had to organize things if you're going to do it. You just can't just shabbily do things. I think I'm roaming around all over the place, but by 1970, I'd had two women artists, Elizabeth Lee Taylor, show work, and her work was about oppressed people. Her drawings are sort of like Katya Kowitz's drawings, and she had a little slogan in her brochure that was from Belina Makuri, the actress, that was about the Greek repression. And as a result, we had calls while we were installing the show saying they were going to bomb the place, which was kind of scary, just two women in the gallery. And then the next thing, after her exhibition, the woman, Bunchy Carter's wife, whom we did not realize we knew one another. She was the matron of honor in my friend's wedding. And she showed up, and she was the person who helped to organize the Black Panther exhibition. And then after that, there were two other women who had shows. And each time, each person then told the next person, and the next thing would happen. So I met, by then there was Elizabeth Lee Taylor, and the women who would come the men were making strong work. Most of the women were still really kind of, had families or learning. And also, I thought I was finished with school. I had a BA in liberal arts or in art, but everyone else was going to school to get master's degrees. So I hadn't heard of Sanga. She was Sue Irons then, but her cousin Eileen was a graphic artist and had an exhibition at Gallery 32. So that's how I met Sanga. And then Betty Saar, of course, knew by ear. Everybody by ear was hearing. The Black Arts Council formed at the Los Angeles County Museum. And then all of a sudden, those people would come because they heard that I had opened a gallery. The Brockman brothers had their gallery already. And that was part of the reason I think that a lot of the artists thought my space should be a gallery, because they saw the brothers over there with these studio spaces that they were having art exhibitions. So Yvonne Colmeo was going to have an exhibition after Eileen. Gloria Bohannon was the wife of the musician George Bohannon. She had two babies, young children. She wanted to have an exhibition, but she didn't want to do it alone. So the photo for that is me with my Afghan John, because I wasn't married, didn't have any children, and she had her babies and that. So that was the kind of woman thing we did. And then finally, because we'd heard about the Carnegie exhibition that had all these male artists, and only one woman who was from New York, and it was a California arts exhibition. And at the time, we had never heard of that woman. And it turns out it was Alma Thomas, who was very, we just hadn't heard of her. We didn't know that many people, women artists, except for people like Marisol or maybe Helen Frankenthaler. We didn't know any women of color. We knew about Elizabeth Catlett because she had been married to Charles White, because she made prints. Ruth Waddy was a printmaker in Los Angeles. And Samela Lewis was the art historian. So we got together because we were really angry and said, okay, let's put together an exhibition. When it was redone by Ortuzar in 2020, I wasn't interested because I didn't remember anything about the Sapphire Show, except that we made a poster that had Betty Saar's last name spelled wrong on it. It had our baby pictures. And I didn't remember that it was a weekend exhibition during the 4th of July weekend. At that time, I was engaged to be married, and I was planning my wedding in 1970. And I totally forgot everything, all the details, until it was redone by Ortuzar. And that's the information that I have about it. And but it turned out that Betty Saar and Sanga Nangudi and I are still the survivors from that exhibition. And the artists at Gallery 32 were just artists like the young artists I've met here, who are all together having exhibitions and working with one another as friends. And it just happens that we were very persistent about what we wanted to do. And then the Brockmans had the CETA program that included Sanga and me. And Betty Saar was always around, and she had her daughters who were also became artists. So we're sort of just in the forefront of women, but I had no idea that we were the first of anything. We just did it. That's a long way to say that we just did that. But I wanted to include those other things because everybody just thinks about Gallery 32 as the space, and it was studio space, and it was alternative space that was not, we had to use the name gallery so people would understand that people would show art there. It wasn't a gallery, really. It was a space, the studio. Just as auroras is a house and a space. And that's the way that artists would have studios. You'd go visit an artist and maybe they were ready to move and they'd tell you about it and we would get good spaces to work. We can't do that now. But it was always this wonderful, and it wasn't cliquish. And at one point we all decided we would, because people were asking the same group of us to exhibit. So we would say, okay, let's each of us have 5 artists that we would like to recommend, at least 1 or 2 of them every time we're asked to have an exhibition. And that's kind of what we were all trying to do as well. The gallery that Tom has, he had an artist that I showed or recommended for another exhibition. And I was shocked to see 50 years later the work that he's doing. So persistence and survival. It's funny, I was asked that recently. The artist walked up to me at my exhibition and said, what would you tell me to do? What would be the wise thing? And then he mentioned that he was already showing with Deitch. He had already been in a collection that I was in. And I said, at your age, I was still struggling trying to get to have an exhibit. And all I've had to do all these years was just keep working no matter what. I made a decision in 1968 that I would not take any jobs that didn't have anything to do with the fine arts. So, and I worked in the post office, but it turned out that post office had all kinds of artists and actors and professors in San Francisco working there. But right after that, I taught art in the 1st and 2nd graders. That's the only way I could teach math and reading. Then I worked in a pearl store where you told people the history of pearls and then you helped them make their jewelry. The only other job I had that was non-art related in the teaching, I drove a meat and seafood truck, and I'm a vegetarian, I was the only girl. But, that to me, working in the arts if you can, being determined, and every space of time that you have, use it. Thinking about the work that you would like to do. Don't give up. The whole art life goes up and down in waves. You can be on top as a young artist. I mean, I was very fortunate that At 22 years old, I had the best gallery in Los Angeles take my work on consignment. And I didn't have a solo show until, that was in 68. My first solo show with that gallery was in 72, but I had these little shows along the way. So making sure to be in group exhibitions with your friends and people you know and keep working. That's all you can do. You just have to just keep going. And there are times that are really low. You just cannot give up. And if you have family, then you have to deal with family. If you have children, you have to put them under your arm like a football and take them everywhere with you. That was really beautiful to see all the babies at one of the openings here. I mean, this is 2026. I wouldn't have a child at this age now for anything in the world. The world that we have to go into, to adopt them or something. But to see that there is a whole new generation of babies being born and that are just as fun. Artist kids. Artist kids are really special because they grow up in an environment sometimes knowing there's money, there's no money, and they learn a balance. And they become really special human beings, I think. So have family, do your work, don't give up.